The morning mist clung to Mirror Lake like gossamer threads, creating an ethereal landscape that made the wilderness survival camp feel otherworldly. Naya Chen stood knee-deep in the shallows, her waterproof boots keeping her feet dry as she studied the lake's gentle current patterns. The water was clearer than she had expected, revealing smooth stones and swaying aquatic plants that would become crucial elements in her strategy. 20 for hours. The challenge parameters echoed in her mind as she watched her fellow students gather their gear along the shoreline. Most were already eyeing the dense forest that surrounded the lake, mentally cataloging trees for shelter construction and undergrowth for insulation. But Naya's gaze remained fixed on the water itself, reading the subtle signs that spoke of depth changes, current flows, and the natural architecture hidden beneath the surface. She had grown up on the shores of Lake Tahoe, where her grandmother had taught her to see water not as an obstacle, but as a living system with its own logic and gifts. Water remembers everything, her grandmother used to say, guiding young Naya's hands as they wove traditional basket boats from chill reeds. It remembers the shape of every stone, the weight of every leaf. Learn to listen, and it will teach you how to float. The memory brought a soft smile to her lips as she adjusted the modified survival kit strapped to her back, while others had packed for traditional forest camping. Naya had spent weeks preparing for an aquatic approach. Her kit contained items that most wilderness instructors would consider unconventional: marine-grade cordage, waterproof adhesive strips, and a collection of materials specifically chosen for their buoyancy and flexibility. Quite the crowd, came a voice from behind her. Naya turned to see her study partner, Felix, approaching with his characteristic unhurried gait. Felix was from Maine, where lobster fishing had taught him patience and respect for water's unpredictable moods. His sandy hair was already tucked under a knit cap, and his weathered hands moved with the unconscious competence of someone who had tied 1,000 knots in rough seas. "They're all thinking vertically," Naya observed, nodding toward the other students who were testing tree branches and measuring distances between trunks. "But look at this lake. It's practically offering us a foundation that's already level, already stable." Felix followed her gaze, his blue eyes taking in the protected cove where fallen logs had created natural breakwaters. "Ambitious," he said, though his tone carried approval rather than doubt. "Building on water means you're working with something that moves." "Exactly," Naya replied, her excitement growing as she spoke. "Instead of fighting the movement, you design for it. Make it part of the structure's strength rather than its weakness." The head instructor, Patricia Reeves, called for attention from a wooden platform erected near the camp's main building. Reeves was a legend in wilderness education circles, a former search and rescue coordinator who had spent 30 years teaching people how to read landscapes and weather patterns. Her silver hair was pulled back in a practical braid, and her keen gray eyes missed nothing as they surveyed the assembled students. "Your challenge begins in 15 minutes, Reeves announced, her voice carrying easily across the water. "You have exactly 24 hours to construct a shelter that will protect you through tonight's weather system." She gestured toward the darkening sky where storm clouds were building with ominous purpose. Current forecasts indicate sustained winds up to 40 miles per hour, with heavy rain and possible severe thunderstorms between midnight and dawn. A murmur of nervous energy rippled through the group. Some students began adjusting their gear with increased urgency, while others stood frozen, perhaps realizing that their original plans might not be adequate for the conditions they would face. "Your shelter will be evaluated on 3 criteria, Reeves continued: structural integrity, environmental adaptation, and innovation. Remember, this isn't about building the biggest or most elaborate structure. It's about creating something that works in harmony with the natural systems around you." Naya felt a familiar calm settle over her as the instructor spoke. This was exactly the kind of challenge she had been preparing for her entire life, growing up with a marine biologist mother and a sustainable architecture father. She had learned early that the best human designs were often inspired by natural systems that had been tested and refined over millions of years. She glanced around at her fellow students and caught sight of Marcus Rivera near the equipment cache. Marcus was methodically checking items in his pack with the systematic approach That made him such a formidable partner in their shared environmental engineering courses. His dark hair caught the morning light as he worked, and when he looked up and found her watching, he offered a smile that sent warmth through her chest despite the cool air. They had been circling each other for months now, sharing late-night study sessions and coffee between classes, but neither had found the courage to acknowledge what everyone else could see. There was something about being out here, away from academic pressures and social expectations, that made possibilities feel more real. 5 minutes, Reeves called out, and suddenly the peaceful morning transformed into focused preparation. Most students immediately began jogging toward the forest, eager to claim the best building sites and materials. But Naya remained where she was, studying the water's surface and feeling the subtle pull of the current against her legs. She closed her eyes and listened to the lake's quiet sounds, the gentle lapping of small waves, the rustle of reeds in the shallows, the distant call of a loon somewhere across the water. When she opened her eyes, she found Marcus standing nearby, his expression thoughtful as he watched her unconventional approach to the challenge. "Building on the water?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Building with the water," she corrected, shouldering her pack and beginning to wade toward a promising cluster of partially submerged logs. "Want to see something impossible become inevitable?" The air horn's sharp blast echoed across the lake, officially beginning the challenge. Round them, students scattered in all directions, racing to claim the best terrestrial building sites. But Naya moved with deliberate calm into deeper water, her mind already visualizing the floating structure that would rise from the lake's surface, like something born from the water itself. 20-5 minutes. That's all she needed to prove that sometimes the most innovative solutions came from embracing what others saw as limitations. Marcus Rivera stood waist-deep in the lake's cool water, watching Naya work with the focused intensity he had come to associate with her most brilliant moments. While other students crashed through the underbrush searching for the perfect tree or the strongest branches, she moved through the shallows like she was reading a blueprint written in ripples and reflected light. "You're not going to ask if I know what I'm doing," she called over her shoulder, her hands already testing the buoyancy of a waterlogged cedar trunk that had settled against a natural stone formation. "I've seen you turn a broken campus fountain into a functioning aquaponics system," Marcus replied, rolling up his sleeves and joining her in the water. "I'm more interested in learning how your mind works than questioning whether it will." The admission surprised them both. Marcus had always been careful with his words around Naya, afraid that his growing feelings would complicate their academic partnership, but something about being here, surrounded by the raw honesty of wilderness and approaching storm, made pretense feel unnecessary. Naya paused in her examination of the logs, meeting his eyes with an expression that held questions they hadn't yet learned how to ask. "Your engineering background," she said after a moment. "How much do you know about displacement and load distribution?" "Enough to know that you're thinking about Archimedes' principle," Marcus answered, his mind already beginning to see the elegant physics behind her approach. "The buoyant force equals the weight of the displaced water." "But you're not just building a raft, are you?" "Better," Naya said, her excitement evident as she guided his attention to the natural arrangement of logs and stones around them. "I'm building a floating platform that adapts to changing water levels and weather conditions. Look how these logs have naturally arranged themselves." Marcus studied the formation with an engineer's eye, noting how the largest log had wedged against two submerged boulders, creating a stable foundation that still allowed for movement. Smaller pieces of driftwood had collected in the calmer water behind this natural breakwater, forming what was essentially a ready-made building site. "The key is flexibility," Naya continued, already beginning to lash the larger pieces together. "With marine-grade cordage from her kit, rigid structures fight the water and eventually lose. But if we create a platform that moves with the waves, that rises and falls with changing water levels, it becomes part of the lake's natural system." Marcus finished, understanding flooding through him like cold water. "That's brilliant, but we'll need to account for wind loading, especially with the storm coming." Thunder rumbled in the distance, still miles away but approaching with the relentless patience of mountain weather. The other Students were becoming increasingly frantic in their building efforts, racing to complete structures before the rain began. But Marcus found himself settling into the methodical rhythm that had always characterized his best work. "Tell me about your kit," he said, beginning to sort his own supplies. "What did you bring that I didn't think of?" Naya's answering grin was infectious. "Waterproof adhesive strips for emergency repairs, marine sealant that cures underwater, and this," she pulled out what looked like a compact emergency shelter. But Marcus could see it had been modified extensively. "I've reinforced the standard survival tarp with additional tie points and weighted corners. It's designed to function as both overhead protection and an emergency sail. If we need to reposition the platform, you've been planning this for weeks." Marcus realized, impressed by the thoroughness of her preparation. "Months," Naya admitted. "Ever since they announced we'd be doing wilderness challenges near water systems. Most survival training focuses on land-based scenarios, but some of the most interesting problems happen at the intersection of different environments." As they worked together, Marcus found himself falling into a familiar collaborative rhythm. With Naya, the same productive energy that had made their academic projects so successful. But here, without the formal structure of classroom assignments, their partnership felt more natural, more equal. She brought intuitive understanding of natural systems, while he contributed engineering principles and structural analysis. "We need to think about anchoring," Marcus said, testing the stability of their growing platform. "The storm will create waves that could push us into the shallows or, worse, into those rocks near the shore." "Already considered," Naya replied, pointing to several strategic points around their construction. "We'll use a multiple anchor system with different lengths of line. Short anchors to prevent drift, longer ones to allow for vertical movement." As the water level changes, the first fat raindrops began to fall, sending circular ripples across the lake's surface, round the shoreline. Students were scrambling to complete their shelters or find emergency cover. But Marcus felt no urgency, only the satisfying sense of working on a problem with someone who understood both its technical challenges and its elegant possibilities. "Naya," he said, pausing in his work to look at her directly, "after this is over, after we've proven that your impossible idea actually works, would you like to have dinner? Somewhere with solid ground and no engineering challenges?" Her laugh was warm despite the cooling air. "Ask me again when we're both dry and have successfully survived the night," she said. "But I'm thinking the answer will be yes." The rain began, in earnest, but their floating platform held steady, moving gently with the water's rhythm like it had always belonged there. The rain arrived with the sudden intensity of mountain weather, transforming the peaceful lake into a churning expanse of silver and gray. Zara Okafor cursed under her breath as she watched her carefully constructed lean-to shed water like a colander, the supposedly waterproof tarp she had salvaged proving to be anything but. Around the shoreline, other students were discovering similar failures as the storm tested every joint, knot, and material choice with ruthless efficiency. From her elevated position near the tree line, Zara had a clear view of the lake's surface where an impossible sight was unfolding. The floating platform that Naya and Marcus had been constructing not only remained intact, but seemed to be thriving in conditions that were destroying land-based shelters. The structure rose and fell with the waves like a living thing, its flexible design absorbing the storm's energy rather than fighting it. "Damn," Zara muttered, watching water cascade through another gap in her shelter. She had built in dozens of environments, from Arctic tundra to tropical rainforests, but she had never encountered a situation where her traditional approaches were failing so spectacularly, while someone else's radical experiment succeeded. Pride warred with practical necessity as she gathered her soaked gear. Zara Okafor didn't ask for help. Growing up in Nigeria before moving to Alaska for university, she had learned early that survival meant self-reliance. Her reputation at the wilderness school was built on solo achievements and individual excellence. But as lightning flickered overhead and her shelter continued its steady disintegration, pride began to seem like a luxury she couldn't afford. The decision crystallized when a particularly strong gust of wind lifted one corner of her tarp and sent it flapping like a wounded bird. Within seconds, Her entire shelter collapsed into a sodden mess of fabric and broken branches. Zara stood in the downpour for a moment, water streaming down her face, then made the choice that would surprise everyone who knew her. She began walking toward the lake. "Permission to come aboard?" she called out as she waded into the shallows, her voice barely audible over the storm's growing intensity. Naya looked up from where she was adjusting anchor lines, her expression shifting from surprise to cautious. "Welcome, depends," she replied, having to shout to be heard. "Are you here to help or to tell us why this won't work?" "My shelter just became kindling," Zara admitted, gesturing toward the collapsed remains visible through the rain. "And I'm starting to think you might be the only ones who actually read the weather forecast." Marcus appeared at the platform's edge, offering his hand to help her climb aboard. "We can always use another pair of hands," he said simply, "especially ones attached to someone who knows what they're doing." The platform felt strange under Zara's feet, solid yet yielding, like standing on something alive. As the structure moved with the waves, she found herself automatically adjusting her balance, her body adapting to the motion with the unconscious skill of someone who had spent years in unstable environments. "This is remarkable," she said, studying the construction with professional appreciation. "You've essentially created a biomimetic design based on how floating vegetation responds to water movement." "Exactly," Naya replied, clearly pleased that someone understood the underlying principles. Rigid structures fail because they try to impose human geometry on natural systems. But if you design something that works with the water's patterns, it becomes anti-fragile. Zara finished, using the term for systems that grew stronger under stress. "The storm isn't damaging your shelter, it's proving its design." As if to demonstrate her point, a large wave rolled under the platform, lifting them several feet higher than the surrounding water level. The structure flexed and adjusted, distributing the force across multiple connection points, then settled back into position as the wave passed. "We need to secure that corner," Marcus called out, pointing to where one of the tarp edges was beginning to work loose. "The wind is creating more lift than we calculated." Zara was already moving, her hands finding purchase on the wet cordage with the automatic competence of someone who had tied emergency knots in Arctic gales. "Give me 30 seconds, she said, producing a specialized cleat from her kit that allowed for quick adjustment under load. Working together, the three of them transformed what could have been a catastrophic failure into a minor adjustment. Zara's hardware provided the mechanical advantage they needed, while Naya's understanding of water dynamics guided the placement, and Marcus's engineering background ensured the load was properly distributed. "Why are you helping us?" Naya asked during a brief lull in the wind. "You could have tried to build something new on shore." Zara considered the question while testing the tension in the modified anchor line. "Because," she said finally, "I've spent my whole life trying to prove I could do everything alone. But watching you two work together, seeing what you've accomplished," she gestured at the stable platform around them. "Maybe the real test isn't whether you can survive by yourself. Maybe it's whether you can recognize good ideas and contribute to them, even when they didn't start with you." Thunder crashed overhead, and the storm intensified with renewed fury. But for the first time since the challenge began, all three of them were smiling. Jin Watanabe had been watching the floating platform for over an hour from his concealed position, in a dense thicket of willows near the water's edge. While other students struggled with collapsing shelters and failing strategies, he remained, dry and comfortable in a space so perfectly camouflaged that even the instructors had walked past without noticing him. Jin's approach to survival had always been different from his more aggressive classmates. Where others saw wilderness as something to conquer, he saw it as a collaborative partner. His shelter wasn't built so much as woven into the existing landscape, using the natural architecture of intertwined branches and carefully positioned stones to create a space that felt less like human construction and more like a secret room that the forest had always contained. But now, as the storm reached its full fury and lightning split the sky with increasing frequency, Jin realized that his perfect hideaway had become a trap. The willows that provided such excellent camouflage were also attracting electrical discharge, and the small stream that had seemed like a convenient water source was rising with alarming speed. Through gaps in the foliage, he could see the floating platform riding the storm's swells with graceful resilience. 3 figures moved across its surface with coordinated precision, adjusting lines and reinforcing anchor points as conditions demanded. Jin recognized Naya's fluid movements and Marcus's systematic approach, but the third person was unexpected. Zara Okafor, the famously independent survival expert, working as part of a team. A massive lightning strike illuminated the lake in stark white light, followed immediately by thunder that seemed to shake the earth itself. In that brilliant moment, Jin saw something that made his blood run cold, a wall of water moving across the lake's surface, like a living thing, a downdraft-driven surge that would overwhelm anything in its path. Without thinking, Jin abandoned his shelter and sprinted toward the water, his art supplies and emergency kit bouncing against his back as he ran. Incoming surge. He shouted over the storm's roar, though he doubted anyone could hear him above the wind. The wall of water hit the platform just as Jin reached the shallows. He watched in fascination and horror as the structure disappeared completely beneath. The surge then emerged seconds later like a whale breaching, shedding water from every surface, but remaining fundamentally intact. That was close, Naya gasped as Jin hauled himself onto the platform, his quiet arrival somehow less disruptive than expected despite the emergency circumstances. Closer than you know, Jin replied, pointing toward the shore where his abandoned shelter was now completely underwater. The whole shoreline is flooding. Anyone who built below the 10-foot elevation line is about to have serious problems. As if summoned by his words, shouts began echoing across the water as students discovered their shelters submerged or swept away. Emergency whistles pierced the storm's noise as instructors mobilized to assist students whose situations had become genuinely dangerous. "We need to help them," Marcus said immediately, already beginning to untie one of the anchor lines. "This platform is stable enough to serve as a rescue staging area." "Wait," Jin said, his artist's eye catching something the others had missed. "Look at the water patterns round those rocks." He pointed toward a section of shoreline where several students were stranded on rapidly shrinking islands of higher ground. "There's a current running between here and there, but it's not uniform. If we position the platform correctly," Jin's hands moved as he spoke, sketching rapid diagrams on a waterproof pad he produced from his kit. His drawings showed how they could use the platform not as a stationary rescue base, but as a mobile unit that could navigate the flood waters using the storm's own energy. "You want to sail a shelter," Zara said, understanding immediately. "That's either brilliant or completely insane. Sometimes those are the same thing," Jin replied, already rigging additional lines to transform their anchor system into a steering mechanism. "Naya, you understand how this water moves. Marcus, you know structural limits. Zara, you've got the hardware we need. I can read the currents and wind patterns." The next hour became a blur of coordinated action, unlike anything the wilderness school had ever seen. Their floating platform transformed from a simple shelter into something approaching a rescue vessel, moving between stranded students with purposeful precision. Jin's artistic training, which had taught him to see patterns and relationships that others missed, proved invaluable in reading the constantly changing conditions. "There," Jin called out, pointing toward a cluster of trees where the students clung to branches barely above the rising water. "We can approach from the northeast and use that eddy to hold position." The rescue required perfect timing and absolute trust between the 4 of them. As they maneuvered close enough for the stranded students to jump to safety, Jin found himself working in harmony with 3 people he barely knew, their individual skills combining into something greater than the sum of its parts. "How did you see that current pattern?" Naya asked as they secured the rescued students and prepared to search for others who might need help. Jin paused in his adjustments to the steering lines, considering how to explain something that felt more like intuition than analysis. "In art school, they teach you that negative space is as important as positive space," he said finally. "Water is negative space made visible. If you learn to see what's not there, you can understand what is." The storm began to weaken as dawn approached, But their improvised rescue operations continued until every student was accounted for and safe. When the instructors finally signaled the end of the emergency phase, the floating platform held not just its original builders, but 6 additional people, who had found safety in its flexible embrace. As the first pale light of morning filtered through the dissipating clouds, Jin looked around at the exhausted but exhilarated faces of his companions. They had started as strangers pursuing individual survival, but the storm had forged them into something unprecedented, a true team, whose combined capabilities exceeded anything they could have achieved alone. So, Jin said quietly, settling back against the platform's edge as calm water lapped gently round them. Who wants to explain to the instructors how we accidentally reinvented maritime rescue protocols? During a survival exercise, the laughter that followed carried across the peaceful lake-like music. Elena Vasquez stood on the observation dock with her waterproof tablet, watching the most extraordinary conclusion to a wilderness challenge she had witnessed in 15 years of coordinating survival exercises. The floating platform that had started as one student's unconventional shelter approach had evolved into something unprecedented, a floating community that had not only weathered the storm, but had actively rescued other participants. As the lead coordinator for the wilderness program, Elena had seen every variation of human response to extreme conditions. She had watched students panic, excel, collaborate, and compete, but she had never seen anything quite like the organic leadership structure that had emerged on that improvised vessel. During the night's crisis, the morning sun painted the lake in shades of gold and amber, transforming the previous night's chaos into something approaching serenity. The platform drifted gently near the center of the lake, its occupants moving with the easy cooperation of people who had been through something significant together. Elena counted 8 figures on the structure, more than double its intended capacity, yet it remained stable and functional. Remarkable, murmured Dr. Patricia Reeves, joining Elena at the dock's edge. The head instructor's silver hair was still damp from her own emergency response efforts during the night, but her expression held the satisfied exhaustion of someone whose students had exceeded every expectation. The structural engineering alone, Elena replied, making notes on her tablet as she observed the platform's continued performance. In daylight conditions, they essentially redesigned the shelter in real time to accommodate rescue operations. That level of adaptive thinking isn't what we were testing for, Patricia finished. We designed the challenge to evaluate individual survival skills under stress. Instead, we accidentally created conditions for something much more interesting. Elena nodded, her attention focused on the group dynamics visible even from this distance. Nia Chen moved across the platform with the fluid confidence of someone in her natural element, checking systems and making small adjustments. Marcus Rivera worked methodically to organize the rescued students' gear, his engineering background evident in how he optimized the limited space. Zara Okafor, who had never been seen to voluntarily collaborate with anyone, was teaching knots to 2 younger students with surprising patience. But it was Jin Watanabe who captured Elena's particular attention. The quiet art student sat cross-legged near the platform's center, sketching rapidly while carrying on what appeared to be animated conversations with multiple people simultaneously. Elena had noted Jin's tendency toward social isolation in previous exercises, but here he seemed to have found his voice as both creator and communicator. "They're not ready to come in yet," Patricia observed, following Elena's gaze. "Look at their body language. This isn't exhaustion or relief at surviving. This is," she paused, searching for the right word, "discovery," Elena supplied. "They've discovered something about themselves, about what's possible when individual strengths align properly." As if responding to their conversation, movement on the platform caught their attention. The group appeared to be preparing for something, organizing themselves with the purposeful energy that preceded significant action. "Are they actually going to sail that thing back to shore?" Patricia asked, incredulous. Elena raised her binoculars for a closer look. Jin was at what appeared to be a steering position, reading wind patterns with the same intensity he usually reserved for artistic composition. Nia and Marcus worked the improvised sail system they had rigged during the night. while Zara coordinated the other rescued students in a way that distributed weight and responsibility evenly across the platform. They're not just sailing it back, Elena realized. They're demonstrating mastery. The platform began to move with deliberate purpose, cutting across the lake's surface at an angle that caught the morning breeze perfectly. What had begun as an emergency shelter had become something approaching a functional watercraft, guided by four people who had learned to read each other's capabilities as clearly as they read natural conditions. Elena found herself holding her breath as the platform approached the dock. This was the moment when theoretical success would meet practical reality, when the night's heroics would either prove sustainable or collapse under scrutiny. But the landing was flawless. Jin called adjustments that Marcus and Naya executed with precision, while Zara managed the dock approach with the calm competence of someone who had done this 100 times before. The rescued students disembarked with genuine reluctance, as if leaving behind something they weren't ready to lose. 25 minutes, Elena said, checking her chronometer against the notes she had made when the construction phase began, from the start signal to functional floating shelter. But that was never really the timeline that mattered, was it? She watched as the four primary builders remained on the platform, even after everyone else had safely reached the dock. They weren't celebrating or showing off. They were having what appeared to be a quiet, serious conversation about something that mattered more than grades or recognition. What do you think they're discussing? Patricia asked. Elena smiled, remembering her own pivotal moments in outdoor education. Those times when challenge and discovery combined to reveal new possibilities. I think they're talking about what comes next, she said. When you've proven that something impossible can work, the question becomes, what else might be possible? As if summoned by her words, Naya looked up from the group's conversation and caught Elena's eye across the water. Even at this distance, Elena could see the transformation in the young woman's expression, the quiet confidence of someone who had tested her ideas against reality and found them sound. Marcus appeared beside Naya at the platform's edge, and Elena noticed how naturally they stood together, their earlier tentative interactions replaced by something more certain. The night's shared challenges had apparently clarified more than just survival strategies. Coordinator Vasquez came Jin's voice as he guided the platform close enough for normal conversation. We have a request. Elena raised an eyebrow, intrigued by the formal tone from someone she had never heard speak up in group settings. We'd like permission to keep the platform operational for the remainder of the program, Naya continued, as a research project on adaptive aquatic shelter systems, and as a proof of concept for collaborative wilderness response protocols, Marcus added, because Zara finished with a grin that transformed her usually serious expression. We think we're just getting started. Elena looked at Patricia, who nodded slowly. Approved, Elena said. But you'll need to document everything. If this approach is as viable as it appears, other programs will want to learn from it. As the first students began animated discussions about research methodologies and documentation protocols, Elena made a final note on her tablet. The wilderness challenge had ended exactly as scheduled, but something new was clearly beginning. Sometimes the most important discoveries happened not when students learned to survive the wilderness, but when they learned to thrive within it.